what Marty and I have been interested in doing over the last year and a half as ESG 2.0, as we've dubbed it, has developed is really to focus on how it has evolved. We've noticed that there have been some real problems in the energy space, particularly, in Europe, there was an over-reliance on renewables and canceling fossil fuel and nuclear and leaving them in the lurch. In addition, there was a problem with greenwashing. And so I think there's a Chinese expression, when there is change, there's opportunity. And so our idea was to really kind of identify how things are changing and where there are opportunities. So today we're going to have Richard Zimmerman, who has a Master of Science in Sustainability Management from Columbia University. He will discuss, when he speaks in his 10-minute portion, talk about a little bit about the ESG protocols, because he really has a studied background over in that. We will also, he works, he has a practice where they're implementing ESG protocols at the We Family Office, which runs $12 billion. In addition, we have Bate, who is returning. I'll introduce everyone else as we go through this. Kylie Fox, with the KRF Capital behind her. We'll also have Lindsay, and she will discuss her new entity, which is very interesting. And so I'll just go through what the basic format is. I'm going to have the four speakers speak for 10 minutes, leave 5 minutes for Q&A. People can ask questions during or at the end of it. And we'll start with Richard Zimmerman, who's a senior advisor at We Family Office, based here in New York, with $12 billion in assets under management. He works with the firm Values Aligned Investing Advisory Service. So, Richard, tell us what that all means. And you have 10 minutes, and we'll cut it off if we go on too long. And people are welcome to ask questions as we go along. And by the way, we have a captain of the national championship collegiate soccer team, who I will not know who that is until the end. A two-time scoring champion, and a really quite extraordinary individual. So go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, that's not me. Not that anybody would have thought so. But, okay, so thank you, everybody. Now we have people online.
Yes.
They're going to say show of hands, but how many people invest in impact and ESG? We're not. Oh, good number. Okay. And how many people have considered it, but just don't quite know how to do it yet? Okay.
It seems to be like a moving target.
Moving target.
Consider healthcare to be impact.
That's a good question.
And
yeah,
we were in Boston 8 years ago talking about impact investing, and all the healthcare guys says, "What about what we do? We cure cancer." Right?
Yeah. I agree with that. That's a good point.
Oh, in that case, I do.
There you go. How many people are totally against it?
Against environment?
ESG.
That's the silent majority.
The silent majority.
Go hide underneath the table if you.
Yeah, no. I mean,
yeah. The one thing I am against is the categorization, the necessity to categorize.
Yeah.
If you're an astute investor, you're naturally going for companies that are performing well, that are not transgressing, that are not causing damage, that are not, hurting, because those would be detriments to performance. So why make the categorization?
Well, it's an evolved concept. I'm not sure everybody's as evolved as you there, because one could argue that companies that are doing this but aren't penalized for it, in essence, could have better profits. So that's been the old argument. I think it's the new argument, which is evolved companies, better management, doing things better, that are taking advantage of these themes are are very good investments. So that's why I approach the business. Plus, I care about the planet too. So it's a passion of mine. Just backing up. So I work for a company that has about 95 families. So I'm in the multifamily office space, but we advise each one separately and with a lot of assets. And so they come to us and we invest across the board in every asset class, trying to get the best returns we can. Private equity, venture capital, co-invest, public markets, fixed income. And for the families that want to express their values in philanthropy and investing, we do that. And for those who just care about these themes, to your point, we'll do that as well. So it depends really upon what the family wants to do. Some families don't have an interest in this at all, but I would say that there's a greater and greater trend emerging where members of the family are very interested in this. And certainly we talked about next generation here. The next generation, also statistically and with kind of demographics and different groups, women will inherit wealth or either create their own wealth, but also get wealth in the next generation. And they are both statistically and in my experience, anecdotally, the ones that are really leading the charge. But it's really becoming everybody now. So it could be based upon values that I don't want this or I want this, or trends as well. And it's across the board. We do investments in affordable housing, very big need in the world, but we've also had very good returns in that category. It could be low income housing, but it could also be workforce development housing. What's the theme? There's not enough housing. There are a lot more people. We all invest in real estate, so it's been a very good category. Food security, climate's broad topic. So climate could be anything to do with the energy transition, which is major. It could be water. It could be obviously sustainable agriculture. All of those things. All of those are trends that we think have a lot of promise to them. And of course, you got to be in it for the long haul as well. So we can work with a family and look at their entire asset base, their portfolio, and examine what's working and what isn't working in it, and then change those investments. So for instance, if we have clients that want to be climate aligned, so we can measure the carbon intensity of their entire portfolio of all their investments, how much carbon is being used in the process of the companies they're investing in, and then look to move out of those and move into better companies that are transitioning, drive down carbon in the portfolio, and then drive up climate solutions. Climate's is the biggest mega trend for the rest of our lives for sure. So we want to be in that investment space. So let me just pause there, just see if there's any sort of questions rather than I just keep talking.
Richard, I have a question.
Richard, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
We know that the Europeans, they did categorize those companies that are ESG and impact investing into Chapter 6 of the SFDR, and then those who are not in Chapter 9. They found out a year later that there is based on regulating, that 22% of this Chapter 6 applicants, they were kicked out.
Yeah.
So that gives us also an idea of what is the state of the market and about the greenwashing
Right.
that is persisting. Now, the SEC here last year in May, they released their first draft, and it very much emulates the Europeans. Now, I am even though I am 100% for ESG and impact, and I turned down the investor, the managers who are from the school of Milton Friedman.
Right.
We all remember of 1972. But at the same time, I am concerned about over-regulating, because over-regulating is going to scare a lot of companies away.
Right.
What's your perspective on
Okay, so break that up. So the question is really about greenwashing and where we're heading with it. And what's very interesting now in the United States is becoming a political hot topic. So the conservative side is taking that as things to talk about. I'm not sure the electorate, whether or not they care a lot, but it's reaching the news, which is really interesting. I look at these as two different things. I think impact is what the company does, good or bad. Do they have whatever they make, whatever they do? ESG is how they do it. So those are two very different things. And the ESG, so you can't say they're the same. So you could have a company that has a benign product, it does pretty well, but it's not looking to sort of create things, healthcare or renewable industry or batteries or something that you know that it's going to have this impact to help the world. But they might do it in a better way in governance. They might hurt the environment less. They might do better for society, or worse, to the earlier point. So the ESG is very different than impact. My sense is that I think Tyson mentioned we're in ESG 2.0. This is just it's going to be a pause. There's going to be a lot of attacks and counterattacks to it, and I think there'll be another shift in it. It'll sort of go down a bit and then come up again and emerge in a way, hopefully, that'll clean out people who are greenwashing and then raise the standards for everybody. So,
What about regulation?
well, I think that I think in anything that is going to be a major trend, regulation can both hurt and help, but I think regulation helps. Yeah, I think, and it depends to the extent of it, but look, the capitalist system, if there isn't regulation put in it, kind of runs amok. We've seen that in terms of what's going on with many things in the environment. So I do think that there has to be some regulation, and then allow the capitalism works. Capitalism is very good at working in any way. They just want to know what the rules are, basically.
Thank you.
So,
Richard, I got a question here. When we spoke yesterday or the day before, I was interested in what you said your firm does with fossil fuels, because this really gets to the crux of it. There are people who are gluing themselves to masterpiece paintings to say fossil fuels will kill us all. And then there are others who are saying, it's causing poverty, and just shutting them all down is very problematic as well. So you seem to be very balanced and have an excellent practice that appreciates the pragmatics as well as the ESG protocols. So could you just briefly describe how you work with natural gas or oil, for example?
sure. So I have to kind of be clear about my firm as a whole, and then also what some clients may want to do in the firm. So we approach investing across the board, both traditional and ESG impact investing. We look at it as what are the best investments. So we do invest in the traditional energy infrastructure, and we actually think at a firm level, there's an important thesis going forward, especially after the Ukraine war. There's going to be a lot more build out here in the United States in the traditional infrastructure, and there hasn't been a lot of CapEx. So we do invest in that space. But there may be a family or a group of families that don't want to invest in that space for either because of the thesis or because of the values. And so, but we still want them to be in infrastructure. We still want them to be in energy. We still want them to be in commodities. So we're going to try to find the best way to do it. The hard area is commodities. We think there's a big cycle coming up that we're in. It's going to be a longer cycle about which will be in the commodity space. But commodities are very dirty. And so you have to say, okay, am I willing to do that if the commodities are, for instance, used in the alternative transportation revolution? And so to what extent? The same way as the sort of social, social issues with it as well. So there becomes a trade-off in that. But if you look at it just from an entire energy portfolio, I think one could argue that you want to mix anyways. With the cost of the renewables out there had dropped so much over the years, and the advent of battery technology and distributed energy, with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is going to be a big tailwind for this industry, there's going to be a lot of investment opportunities in this space, and it should be considered as a part of your energy mix in your portfolio as well. And then you can decide: do I still want to drive down carbon in my portfolio and drive up renewables and transition, or I'm okay with the mix that I have? That's kind of a personal decision from the client's point of view.
Perfect. That's you just stopped at 10 minutes and 2 seconds. So what I'm going to do now is go to yet another extraordinary speaker, Kylie Fox, who's raised $95 billion in project finance and is actively involved in projects now with a measurable impact. In particular, when we were speaking yesterday, she was talking about trends that are occurring in Europe, also biofuels in aviation, hydrogen, and how that can be pushing against EVs and battery technology. So without any more, Kylie Fox.
Thank you very much for the tee up, Tyson. Yeah, it's great to speak to everyone. Basically, we've been doing a lot of work in the renewable space. We started in solar, we've been doing green methanol, but after sort of the last few months, what I've seen, especially with, as the previous speaker mentioned, the Inflation Act, there's an enormous amount of momentum building. So between the Ukraine war and Europe needing to become energy independent, a lot of these technologies, frankly, aren't really all that new. It's just that there wasn't a hydrogen market or a push to move in this direction previously. So with the Ukraine war, there's a push, obviously. We spoke with one company over in Switzerland. They had built a waste to energy hydrogen plant 3 years ago, and there was no market for it, so they actually had to close it. Now they have about 10 billion of plants that they're ready to build across the world, ranging from Europe to Africa, and also in Latin America. And they also want to have a foothold in the US. So there's a number of European companies who are already public and building out waste to energy to hydrogen or waste energy to aviation fuel. And because of the Inflation Act, they also want to get a foothold in the US. Plus, there are a number of US companies that are also building the technology here. And it's also interesting even from a jobs perspective. So one of a Norwegian company who does the waste to aviation fuel, they want to move the manufacturing of their equipment from China to the US and have already identified 2 different sites. So there's basically a massive momentum of actually finally implementing hydrogen, both from a mass transit point of view, shipping vessels, and then eventually into cars. Ford has announced that they're going to be moving into that. Delta has committed to using synthetic fuels on an ongoing basis. Shipping vessels are also being built to run on green energy, which could be methanol or hydrogen. And then hydrogen will definitely be layered into the mass transit, both in Europe and across the world and the US. So we feel like we're going to be leapfrogging over the whole battery issue. Batteries have so many issues in terms of the mining, in terms of the recyclability. So we feel like it's almost like a stepstone technology that people have been focusing on. And to quote one of the waste to energy to hydrogen guys, they think that this has been the biggest greenwashing scam to date. So we feel like there's a huge shift that's going on. We think that it's extremely positive, as hydrogen is very, will be very impactful in terms of reducing the carbon. And there's a number of other technologies that are out there, both from cleaning up dirty water to the point that you can use it for agriculture and for industrial. There's also ways of converting humidity into drinking water. So there's a lot of momentum in the climate tech space. And I feel like from an investment point of view, besides the project finance and people getting into the FID stage, probably the biggest gap in financing is the earlier stage development, because the hydrogen plants take about 4 years to build, of which 2 is comprised of engineering work and plant equipment building. So there's, from an efficiency point of view, a lot of the large institutionals, they don't want to have their money or just 30 to 50 million locked up for 4 years. They'd rather come in at the FID stage, put down 200 to 500 million, and then basically either have an exit or have an operating business after 2 years, because economically and from a return perspective, it makes more sense. So we feel like in terms of getting this done, perhaps the Inflation Act will kind of help that seed capital get funded. But also there's going to be so many new businesses, from building out the infrastructure of hydrogen distribution. One thing for the family offices and famous people, when the new jets get retrofitted and they can run on synthetic fuel, they won't be attacked by the public for using jet fuel, and they'll be using green fuel. So that's one positive perhaps to look forward to. But anyway, we feel like there's a lot of great momentum. There's a lot of great climate tech companies to invest in. We invest at the portfolio company level. I have a capital markets background. So then I work as a strategic investor with those portfolio companies to help them tap the capital market to raise either the development capital, but also to put into place the project finance and also find strategic partners. So we do the affordable housing too, which is also set up as modules, and there, one company reduces your heating bill by 70% and your air conditioning by 40%. One company you don't even need, it's so well insulated, and that the way that they construct it on site, you don't even need skilled labor because it's modules, so they just plug and play it like Legos, or fit in the hinges. So there's a lot of great stuff going on in the climate tech space, and we feel like not only is it transformational, we feel like there's just an enormous amount, because you have to go build a hydrogen market. There's huge liquidity in the carbon credit market. So all these businesses are actually running like the waste to energy to hydrogen AG. You're looking at 60 to 80% margins on these deals. So they're lucrative, they're good for the environment, and they're the future essentially. So that's our thesis in terms of investment and where we see the market.
Richard told me that he wants to keep it exciting and will allocate 100 million to 500 million to the best pitch in our segment. So Kylie, if you could kindly pitch one or two, you've got another 4 minutes.
So one of the deals we're working on is a waste to energy plant, and it's just that, but basically there's like a 12 billion runway that we can do. So we're looking for about 50 million at the corporate level so they can acquire brownfield sites, and then we layer in the project finance as we build out the plants along the way. And then, as I mentioned, there's a company called EcoPanel, where you don't even need heating, and they're set up with pure, like they satisfy all the ESG requirements, and they can build them everywhere. They sustained against housing, against natural disasters like flooding and storms and earthquakes, and there's pictures of them kind of being the last house standing. So it's a great option for affordable housing that also is ESG and also reduces your overall running costs. And then the last one, which is actually quite interesting and a great solve for solar and wind, is they use saline to dig through to the cavern, like create caverns in the earth, and you can store wind and solar energy there for over 48 hours, and thereby solving the peak to trough issues that solar and wind have in terms of storage. So they are looking for about 30 million to set up their company in the US, or already established in Europe. And then from a project finance point of view, each one of these projects are about 500 million each to build.
That's excellent.
I have a question for the lady.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here. Tyson?
Go ahead.
Miss, I do invest in renewable energy, and liquid hydrogen is definitely on top of my list. But
Yeah.
I like to hear your perspective on the storage of the hydrogen and also on the transportation of the hydrogen in light of the recent train cars explosion in Ohio that the media doesn't want to talk about, and that is turning the sky black up there, and the impact on the population in that area.
To be quite frank, I'm not aware of the story that you're talking about, although I have done a lot of due diligence and a lot of pressing to the companies that we work on in terms of the stability of hydrogen. And there are many methods. So typically you don't really, if you want, in order to transport hydrogen, you compress it, and you usually use methanol or ammonia to keep it stable. But there's ways, basically they use compression, and then they also can use like methanol or ammonia to stabilize it. But normally the way that they do it to keep it stable is to compress it, essentially. And but look, I can't speak to maybe someone who didn't do things properly and an accident happened. I mean, there's been oil rigs that pollute the water because of an accident. There's been accidents on the road with oil tankers.
I see.
Accidents can happen. So I can't really speak about that particular thing, but there's been a lot of work and advancement made in order to make it stable and also to facilitate transportation of it.
We have
over
another question. We have
Yeah,
another
I just
question.
want to tell you, Mitch, that same renewable energy that you call the liquid hydrogen, and I've been investing in it. It's still in the nascent stage. It is not for investment. It's not an investment grade yet, because to compress it and you did not say how we're going to transport it, and nobody can control accidents, and you did not tell me anything new. But this is still in a
Well, I
nascent
don't
stage.
really
that
actually.
I will not encourage.
Yeah, I don't
I
really
think the
agree with the
issue
statement.
is-
It's completely investment ready and completely safe.
I see. Marty,
Fantastic,
I don't
Kyle.
really
I think the
agree
issue
with
is that oil, natural gas has been de-risked,
simple.
right? Because it's been transported for so long and through so many
That's
ways.
explosive.
We have a question from John.
More importantly, what are the economics of hydrogen production? And how much energy do you need to make hydrogen in the first place? So what's the balance here?
What's the
You
trade-off?
know,
What's
like 2 to 3 kilowatts. You can power this with solar, so you can use it that way. You're also
How do
in
you
order
get solar?
to run that, but
Correct.
you're, I mean, in terms of what you're feeding in is pure biomass and plastic, so you're getting rid of waste. And then on the energy and in terms of the profitability, I mean, 3 of my companies are operating between 60 to 80% profitability, because the spot market and also the offtake contracts for hydrogen are quite lucrative these days. And then secondly, the carbon credits are also quite lucrative. So once they're up and running and operational, they get the benefits of the carbon credits. And then secondly, it's cheap energy in terms of the cost of energy to power it. And the hydrogen is actually at a high level right now. Obviously,
Kyle, where are your projects located?
What's
Where are
that?
your projects located?
They're in the US, they're in Europe. There are
More
some of them are
energy to make
in
hydrogen
Africa
next
and the
to
Middle
you.
East, but most of the ones that I'm working on are in the US and Europe.
Most of them are industrialized. Okay, Steve McCarthy has a question. Steve?
Sure, quickly, if this has been talked about, stop me. I read an article interesting in The Economist. They talk about getting away from greenwashing. There's some issues about regulatory harmonization. The SEC is stepping in, apparently, making sure that companies report accurately on climate change. There's a big difference between the US and the rest of the world. You want to comment on that, please?
Yeah, that's.
Anybody? Everybody.
So regulatory, so there's a difference in the way people report data and compliance. Maybe that's something that Bate can tackle after Kyle finishes. Right? Because I think that's more of a Bate. No, we have one more question for Kyle. Yeah.
Kylie, based on the forward curve for REX, what do you think is the percentage of the margin that is attributable to REX in, let's say, the next 5 years?
The tech wrapper?
The renewable energy credits.
What percent of the margin is from the renewable energy credits?
You mean the carbon credits?
The carbon credits, yes.
20 to 30?
Okay. Alrighty. Any other questions here?
Which is.
We can
Hey,
come back.
you stop being an agitator. Okay, well, let's move on to the next guy.
Okay, well, again, we have another fabulous speaker, Bate.
Watch out for that guy in the hat. He's always trouble.
EP Valuation.
Do you have a question?
Okay.
Okay, Bate?
Good afternoon, can you hear me
Let
okay?
introduce Bate. Bate does ESG reviews and emissions impact analysis as part of EP Valuations, a company he owns in Texas. He and I have had some discussion about buying natural gas properties where they can be converted into LNG in Louisiana and Texas. But he has several other business ideas, again, that are real ESG type actionable projects. Bate, you got 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think I'll need 10 minutes, but I'll start with, my name is Bate. I am with EP Valuation. We're in Houston and Dallas, but our clients and the projects they fund all over the United States. We see quite a bit of deal flow. And what we do is we provide due diligence, asset valuation, and ESG reviews for banks and sponsors and operating partners in the energy space. The work we do for our clients enables them to make careful and thoughtful but defensible investments or lending, as the case may be, within to oil and gas companies. Now, my background is I'm a petroleum engineer by training. I'm a professional engineer. I have an MBA from UT Dallas, bachelor's in engineering from Montana Tech, and I have been in the oil and gas space for 22 plus years. Before grad school, I worked for Schlumberger. After grad school, I worked for a company called Remington Oil and Gas, and I was part of the core team that built Remington from a few assets in the Gulf Coast, East Texas, and deepwater offshore, and sold it to Helix Energy Solutions Group for $1.4 billion in 2006. Since then, I've been on the bank side, valuing assets, lending, investing in oil and gas companies. Now, turning to ESG, I think part of the issue has already been addressed, which is there is a greater ESG awareness right now. Right? When we sit through presentations, at least last year, about 85% of the presentations we sat through had an ESG slide. That is up from under 10% in 2010. So that's already material improvement. The challenge remains verification. Most of the data is self-reported. There is no independent verifier. There's no regulator that verifies the data. The EPA collects the data and publishes it, but there's no screening of that data. There are private companies, however, who are doing some of the work of verifying. So there's Rystad, for example, that does some of that work. There is a company called Trustwell or Project Canary that does excellent work in this space. And what Project Canary does is they will come to your field location with equipment, as long as you pay for it, and they'll measure emissions on a continuous basis, which essentially begins to set the baseline for that company. And they'll help you identify, 4 emitters and high sources of carbon and leakage and all that. And then they present a plan to management to address these issues. And if management takes the necessary steps, properly addresses issues, reduce emission, they have different categories of classification, but essentially you can get to what is called responsibly sourced gas, which essentially means that the operations are efficient enough and clean enough for an oil and gas company that you get this designation. And I'll give you an example. This year, there was an article published by Reuters about Tokyo Gas, which is a large Japanese company. They import about 15% of LNG to Japan. Well, Tokyo Gas is acquiring a company called Rockcliffe Energy for $4.6 billion. One of the reasons for this acquisition is Rockcliffe is a good producer in the Haynesville, close to the Gulf Coast, and very close to export terminals for LNG, which Tokyo Gas needs. The other is Rockcliffe is a responsibly sourced gas company, right? They went through the process of cleaning up field operations, converting to more efficient operations, reducing emissions, and then getting that designation. Tokyo Gas itself, in 2021, signed a contract, being one of the first international companies to do so, signed a contract to become a responsibly sourced gas company. Right? So Japan needs the fuel, but Japan is also signatory to climate accords. So this company is trying to balance national priorities with national commitments. And the US is increasingly becoming a friendlier jurisdiction than, say, Russia and other countries for sourcing that gas. I bring this both up because part of the work we do is we look at the company's operations, look at management and the technical team, and try to figure out what steps this company needs to take to improve its carbon footprint. And we work with our lenders on a metric that works for them to arrive at that number. The first thing we do is we look at profitability. And you might say, well, you should do that anyways. Yes. But the reason we pay attention to profitability is that companies who are struggling will not keep ESG commitments. They just won't. And so we would focus on making sure that the company is profitable through multiple cycles. The second, when there's a demand for funding, is does that demand include the necessary cost to decommission or clean up project site? Right? Because we want to make sure that our clients are responsible enough not to simply sell down old wells to a smaller operator who cannot properly decommission them. And so we add the cost of decommissioning project sites in the funding. The third is we encourage the banks we work with to provide a discount in the pricing to companies that hit certain ESG metrics. And the reason is very simple. Cleaner operations improve profitability, right? And so ESG 2.0 is becoming less an abandoned ship for oil and gas and more, a stewardship of the environment, right? We need oil and gas. We're going to need it for a while, but we can do better in terms of environmental management. And so if banks can provide a discount in the pricing, in the loan pricing, to companies who move material along this path, then it helps to encourage more oil and gas companies to improve their operations, which in the end makes them more profitable.
Bate, I have a question. I just want to jump in for a second here. So there's a real global need for energy, right? And there's this bifurcation between industrial and non-industrialized emerging markets, et cetera. And so there's a huge demand for energy, but if you go through decarbonization, let's say, it's going to be very difficult for the countries where there's all the growth gathering energy, right? So any thoughts on that? I mean,
yes. So one thing to keep in mind is there are probably 2 to 3 billion people on the planet who are energy insufficient. And oil and gas is, at this point, the most developed energy source that is most likely to reach them first. If oil and gas becomes cheaper, they become energy sufficient sooner. And so I don't see oil and gas going away. I see prices dropping over time, perhaps, as renewables and other energy sources come into the mix. But the requirement for energy and the ability to move oil and gas quickly between countries and within countries is such that you can't get rid of it, right? You cannot build a grid in Cameroon or Nigeria or the Congo overnight, but you can move oil and gas overnight. And that is a primary at this point. That could change in the future. Certainly at this point, you can't get rid of oil and gas, but you can improve how we operate it and improve the reliability in how it gets to people.
So I guess, and I'm gonna get to Steve's questions next, but my perspective is that, and like a little bit of factoid, is that France gets 30% of its uranium from Nigeria. Nigeria it has 90% energy inefficiency, but France won't share any technology for using carbon with Nigeria. So they won't share technology for burning coal or anything like that. So I don't know. It seems to me, I'll call it neo-colonization, right?
Yeah, well, so that's a good point. And let's take the DRC, for example, right? By some estimates, the Congo currently has almost 90% of the cobalt and other minerals required for electric batteries and our phones and all that. But the Congo is an energy starving country in terms of energy, right? And the entire ecosystem for mining is not nearly as clean as most oil and gas operations. So you can say, well, I have an EV, that's great, but the battery that powers your EV was produced through a process that is dirtier than oil and gas drilling today. So the goal of ESG is not so much to compare oil and gas to EV as it is to ask the question, can we have operations that are cleaner, environmentally friendly, and responsive to the people who live around these operating areas, right? Because we want to make sure that whichever company follows well-established rules, is accountable to the society in which it operates, and is able to make a profit, but does so in a manner that is dignified of the people on whom it runs, right? So the Congo, for example, the people making $1 a day mining cobalt for an industry that is billions in profit. And you have to ask yourself, is that ESG? It isn't, right? So we can do better and we should do better. I'm on the oil and gas side. So my goal isn't so much to knock EVs, that's not the point. The point is that ESG is not just about the type of energy. It's about the process by which that energy is produced.
Marty, I'd like to kind of answer your
I think
question.
Steve had a question.
Okay, go
Steve
ahead.
McCarthy?
Please talk to me about the regulatory regime in both places. Apparently, the United States and Europe are two different ways, and they're trying to standardize reporting requirements for how companies report this stuff.
So yeah, this gets back to Camille's question about data and reporting and regulatory.
Anybody take it?
Well, I don't know much about Europe, but in the US, there have been a few proposals, right? The challenge for many oil and gas companies that I work with, and I know this very directly, is cost. Right? To measure emissions accurately and repeatedly, you need equipment in place for a long time, and that is not cheap. So companies are balking at the cost to do that. The irony of it is that ESG is most often pushed when the oil and gas industry is in the downturn, when companies have no money to actually buy this equipment. It should be pushed now when oil is $80 and perhaps going to 90. Then there's enough profitability to make those investments. And so I think those regulations are important, but the cost associated with performing on those regulations is really what the industry balks at. I don't know what's happening in Europe. I can't speak to that.
I have a question for Richard, actually. Another one?
Yeah, we have one more question.
Okay,
Tyson here. It's a busy group. We're going to extend the time.
It's been a long time since so many sin stocks and all that nonsense, right, Richard? So who are the best performing ESG funds in terms of Voya, JP Morgan, separate accounts? And what are their return profiles for top performers with the S&P?
Well, I don't think I'm going to give you any names here,
Okay,
but I would say that
what return profiles should we expect from well-managed ESG funds?
I think if we looked last couple of years, but not last year.
Okay. Correlation between stock and bonds. A lot of correlation between stock and bonds.
We had some very good outperformance with kind of typical risk characteristics among either ESG or impact thematic managers, both US and globally. Now, some are going to look just like the index or relatively like it. And I would say that's not really where we're interested in investing. We want at least companies that are doing things more specifically for impact. But the returns were good. There were good tailwinds. Last year, it was a very difficult year for everybody.
Absolutely.
The growth stocks got killed, as we know, and a lot of the ESG funds are growth oriented. But if you look at those underlying companies, and we did the analysis, they're very good companies. They just got hurt by the growth issues. In fact, the fact that many of them had a lower or no allocation to oil really only hurt them by a small percent, because oil in the index wasn't that much anyway.
In a year, unlike last year, in terms
Right.
of the previous 5 years, what is the outperformance of a top ESG performer versus the S&P? 200-300 basis points, what?
Oh, yeah. I mean, some on the top ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's been
Several hundred basis points.
several hundred basis points.
So I'm going to table that. Let's move over to Lindsay
Sorry.
because I don't think she's spoken.
But there could be higher.
That's
volatility.
correct.
Yeah,
All right, I'd
and we
like
don't
to-
have a former pro soccer player and Olympic champion many times that our group. So.
Oh, I don't think she went to the Olympics.
I didn't.
But
Oh,
she is.
national champ.
But perhaps you could clarify the record. You're the National Player of the Year twice, captain of the Stanford University soccer team, and leading scorer for 2 years in the country. But you were not. You were not. in the Olympics.
Is this the ESP award, ESPN award? Yeah, ESPN award.
Ben
Beckham, right?
I will pivot. I will. The correct is that I was the National Player of the Year and the captain of Stanford's first national championship team. I was a two-time first-team All-American.
That's
I also played for the U.S. national teams up to the pre-Olympic level, at which point I got hurt.
What was your
And
role?
I was a forward. I led the nation in scoring twice.
Wow, that's
I'm not hurt anymore.
I'm not hurt anymore.
Don't do
But
anything.
I'm probably not hurt anymore because I spend most of my days in office rooms like this. Yeah,
What was your position?
I was a forward.
Well, you can have
In
a
my days,
football
we had
machine.
center forwards and right.
Football.
Football
Yeah,
machine.
there you go. Football, exactly.
All right, so let's talk
Yeah,
about.
let's talk about what I actually do now.
But the more exciting part is that she went to Stanford University, has a Bachelor of Science Technology and Bachelor of Science in Science Technology and Society, and Management Science and Engineering, and also has an MBA from Columbia University. She's done 7 billion, I guess, in with Evra, her company, which she's founded and CEO of infrastructure. And she's raising a fund right now of 250 million focused on energy, mobility, smart city sectors. It's a woman-owned minority firm that gets a first look at a lot of large projects. So please tell us a little about, the project.
Lindsay, we are
You took
proud
the
of
punchlines.
We are
Tell us
There you
about
go.
the smart road or highway.
Yeah. I'll get to that. No, I appreciate that background. As Tyson mentioned, I spent a number of years in the infrastructure space since I played soccer. So doing billion-dollar infrastructure transactions for many major cities, universities, states across the country in those sectors. But what I also had the fortune of seeing while I was doing those major infrastructure projects was that there was a gap in the market. A gap in the market where tier 2 all the way out to rural communities oftentimes don't get the looks of major fund managers because the reality is they have to deploy $1 billion on every opportunity. It doesn't mean that they're not good projects. You can't drive good impact. You can't drive good profit. It just means that from an efficiency perspective, it just doesn't necessarily make sense, which means that there's an opportunity in the market. That was one of the tenets of the genesis of the fund that I'm founding today, which is called Evra. It's a $250 million fund. We are focused on the next generation of infrastructure technology solutions, in particular clean energy, mobility, as well as broadband. We're doing it a little bit of a different way in that we're investing into companies and then also supporting them in the assets that they produce. In that way, we serve as a bridge to provide that first project financing capital before you get to those $20 billion asset managers, while also being able to provide that project financing capital to these smaller communities. What that also means for our investors is that they get stable cash flow off of about 60% of our fund at higher returns than some of these brownfield and more traditional assets at about a 16 to 23% year over year over 12 years. But you also get an upside kicker from the corporates that we invest into as well. Our core tenet is that we are both mission and profit driven. So we are not investing into a company where we don't get mission, and we're not investing into a company where we don't get profit. Where one of those things are missing, it's a no-go for us. So we use the deployment of infrastructure as a means to drive impact. At the end of the day, we all sit in buildings, we drive on roads, we use broadband to do our work from home. We all use electricity. Really trying to drive the idea that infrastructure can be a foundational component for communities, but also a means in which you can go that extra step and drive impact in communities as you deploy that infrastructure. So that's core to our thesis. We measure every company, every project that we do across ESG metrics, UN SDGs, and really look to have a formalized process for that as we deploy capital. Yes.
Sure. Where's your mix of domestic and international?
We are
Companies.
North American.
North American only.
Yeah, the reality is that many of these companies will have a natural progression into other markets. We're a new fund though, so we're about to make some of our first deployments.
And what is the balance of institutional versus high net worth family offices you're expecting to attract?
You tell me.
Because I think that given a minority owned firm, given the space, I suspect the institutional side may be very interested in putting money out, and that the domestic or family office side will be a little bit more reluctant. That's the impression I have. Tell me if I'm right or wrong.
Well, I will tell you that we started with the institutional side. We've only been on the market for a few months and we've gotten some interest there. those are longer processes, right?
Yeah.
So we're
It's like-
we're going through those conversations. Yeah, go ahead.
Most new funds actually, it's family offices that come in.
Seed at the
first,
beginning, yeah, but I mean, the big
yeah.
dollar checks, yeah.
Yeah.
Come, because I
Yeah.
expect that, that's an attractive institution.
Yeah,
Give
but
you
you
even
have
more.
those investors like Franklin Templeton, like the state of New
Yeah, of
York,
course.
they have programs
Ontario
like money
pension.
managers, women led, so we have this segment too, right?
Ontario
so that-
teachers, there's a lot of.
Yeah, so there's a lot of those, but we also have found recently that there are some family offices who get really inclined to our vision, our mission. You know, we're able to offer quite a bit of co-investment to fund investors, which can bring really attractive deal opportunities. As was mentioned, we're the first woman and minority-owned infrastructure fund in the US market. So there's actually requirements in public infrastructure projects for 10 to 20% of the equity to go to those firms.
Set asides.
And so that's not even where we're getting the majority of our deal flow, right? Like we're going out and we're developing our own deal flow, but then we also have the other deal flow that we can tap into other relationships we have for other firms that are developing in larger markets.
So,
Are you structured to co-invest? Are you the lead investor typically? Do you work with other funds? How do you organize yourselves?
So we are structured as a lead investor. That's our bread and butter. I've always been doing lead investments, developing deals from the ground up. So our fund, at a minimum, will have a 1-to-1 ratio of investing capital from our fund and offering that same amount of capital for co-investment. The reality is that the way in which we invest into companies and then we support them in their asset-based deployments. Our idea is that those asset-based deployments are aggregations of small communities across North America. That can become a very large portfolio of investments of stable cash flow that investors can get.
Do you have a pipeline of deals and companies?
We do. I can give you a highlight of one of our first deals, and I can't, this is on video, so I can't go into too much detail, but happy to talk more about it offline. You think about a roadway just as a typical road that has asphalt or cement. What if you took that roadway, you put fiber in it, you put sensors in it, and you put wireless EV charging in it, so that a road now became an access point for broadband, became a point for traffic data analytics for public sector, commercial entities, and enabled you to charge your car down the road and as you drove it, or a bus to do the same thing. And you can also think about things like smart cement and sustainable cement and sustainable asphalt so that you reduce the carbon footprint.
Is it
So is that a
federal?
venture capital fund? Which stage are you investing?
So this company's already raised almost $10 million to date. So it's like a Series A plus sort of round.
So that,
go ahead.
so that company happens to be located in some state, right? Who's the state regulators? How do they fund the highways? What's the problem for? In other words, if you go through that process, you're gonna say, okay, what are the feds and what are the state regulatory requirements that allow me to do that? Or is there any?
Yes, you are 100% correct. You cannot remove regulatory requirements from infrastructure. Full stop. You can try to reduce your risk. Our CTO is the CTO for the city of Chicago. He's got 25 years of political and technical expertise. And we try to analyze those political and regulatory processes from the upfront point of a process. We bring on local advisors to deal with both the local and the federal government.
Okay.
Their projects are with municipalities, they're with corporates, they're with departments of transportation that will ultimately scale across the country.
Tell us something about your other partners in the GP.
So one of them I just mentioned, he was a CTO for the city of Chicago. That's the two senior partners right now. We also have an analyst. We're working to our first fund close where we'll be able to bring on other senior partners. We have several board members who also have deep political and technical ties as well.
So I assume you're not competing with BlackRock or Blackstone on an infrastructure fund because they're gonna put out a lot of money. Who would you be competing with?
Right now, there's no one.
Early stage.
So actually, the reality is that Blackstone has a great impetus or incentive to work with her
Okay.
and bring her on as a co-investor on projects. So there was
There we
a,
go. Yeah.
because there was a Black-owned private equity fund. We're still, I mean, we're pretty massive now, but when they first started out, a company was told that Fortress is doing a roll-up, and they were saying, well, how are we gonna do? Because now we're going from a whole bunch of 50-person companies to a company of 3,000 people, and there's all kinds of compliance that we have to do with employment, et cetera, and the government gave them, they said, if you can find a minority-owned partner on the private equity side, then we're gonna give you a special dispensation for XYZ amount of time. They said, come up with $70 million, they invested $70 million, it's Gen X 360 is the fund, And Fortress returned the money in 18 months at like a 2x. And as soon as Princeton University saw it, Princeton gave them another $100 million, and then they were off to the races.
Sure.
So I'm just saying, there's always incentives. in
Like
structuring
the old municipal finance business, public finance.
Yes.
But this case, that's, Blackstone is like a private equity. You're doing A, B, which, where is your?
So the corporate side for us, what we look for is proven technology, no science projects. Companies that are now ready for commercialization of their physical infrastructure assets. That typically means it has to be at least a Series A round. We could go all the way to Series C, but what we require is that we have the first look or exclusivity for any asset-based deployments. We're not really, pushing for having the largest stake. We could go to a Series C and still take that right. But because that's really where our value add is.
Did you say you're focusing more on the periphery? Is that the thesis?
Yeah, so tier 2 all the way out to rural communities that
Yeah.
where large fund managers aren't necessarily focused.
Right, exactly.
That's
So,
where the infrastructure build's gonna be spending its money.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Yeah,
between,
Better valuations potentially.
so between Stanford,
Tougher.
Columbia, and kicking that round ball around, where did you work before IVA? The firm
Yeah.
you had, how much time, and where were you at?
I was at Meridium here in New York. We're actually a Paris-based fund manager, $25 billion of assets under management.
How long?
I was there for 8 years. I was leading projects in the sectors that
And
we're
you
talking
jumped out
about.
to start this on your own.
I jumped out to start this.
Got it.
Not only that, she self-funded it. Just to repeat, she has self-funded the company thus far.
Plus,
which
So
is-
with a Stanford and Columbia degree, what do you expect? Gee, right?
But she made the money playing professional soccer.
So,
Some of it. Could have a whole debate on that topic.
We're embellishing. It's in the day. Tyson, we got 10 minutes.
About your road company.
Well,
one of the easiest things to do is-
I've heard all I want from these, I've heard what I want from our speakers. I would encourage them to put up their contact information in the chat space so people know how to reach them. And then I guess we can handle some more questions. I'm not seeing the questions from Marty. If you want to manage this part.
I think Steve McCarthy's got a couple more questions.
You know me, terrible, terrible. Listen, one of the firms I recognize is Macquarie. They did a lot of work coming from Australia over to do this, and they came around earlier in the cycle. What about them, and who are some of the other players?
Yeah, so Macquarie was one of the competitors in my last place. And I don't consider them a competitor to us. At the end of the day, we're looking at very niche solutions. They want to deploy $200 million on every opportunity minimum. Right, so when we come in and are able to do a smaller check, we're able to develop these niche solutions. We're able to go to a place with less competition. We're not bidding against 8 other bidders. And so they're compatible to us. Ultimately, we can come in and we can write an MWP check on some of their opportunities. But they're not competing with us in some of these smaller markets.
Are you able to put together like portfolios of those smaller deals and then take them to partner with some of these companies and say, look, I know you like to invest in $200 million deals, but I've got a portfolio of 10 deals that adds up to $200 million. You thought about something like that, or?
Sure. I mean, we could. We don't see it as a need, right? Like we'll raise capital for our fund. We'll offer co-investment opportunities first to our fund investors. And then if there's additional project finance capital that we need in the market, we can go out to those firms where there's some compatibility.
do you do any ACTA, or is that part of your domain, or?
I could see it being possible. It's definitely within the thesis. It's not part of our first deals, but it definitely could work.
Speaking of sports, how do you leverage the money of guys like Michael Jordan, LeBron James, and the whole sports world that has got tons of money willing to put up?
No, yeah, there's a whole theory around that. It's never easy. They have a lot of people
I'm
in
just saying,
contact.
there's a lot of people, ex-handlers, that again, with a sports background and accomplishments you've had.
Serena
maybe
Williams.
a very interesting, and Williams, very, very
You guys
interesting
manage your money,
angle.
don't you? Don't you manage Serena Williams' money? Oh, sorry.
What, you knucklehead?
Signs
You gotta get rich
confidentiality
in trouble.
agreement.
No, but I'm serious about that. I mean, in terms of, there's a huge market for sports sports stars that are making hundreds of millions of
Kevin
dollars,
Durant.
their own family offices.
They're surrounded by people that are. looking
Yeah, but I'm not talking about, but the handlers and the crazy, guys that, from the old neighborhood, I'm not talking about those guys, I'm talking about the senior seasoned guys that those guys pick to run their family office, family investment.
We've had attorneys
That's what-
leave the firm to join. groups
Absolutely.
like that.
Absolutely,
Yeah, out of
and that's another
LA.
fine,
James, obviously a
yeah,
billionaire.
and others.
You have a question?
I like to follow up on this conversation, and for the length of time, I know Lindsay and her investments. I think it's a great idea to have some of the retired athletes that you're talking about, and they are friends of mine and Lindsay, and we can share the names with you later.
Dan
But
Martin does the same.
we should have a panel sitting right here, and they are the panelists, and then you can address them with all.
We'll
those
do that
questions.
with Tim Draper.
How about that
in
friend?
2
How
months.
about the guy, how about the
You're
guy
coming back,
from FOE,
Wonderful.
Kovanov, Chris Kovanov, FOE.
You didn't know that.
I know that.
Where you?
You know Chris Kovanov?
San Francisco, but
What's that?
spent a lot of time in New York.
Family office,
San
family office,
Francisco,
FOE.
New York.
Yeah, I
I know,
know,
I
what
should
about
say
it?
that.
He's got a lot of sports guys.
Really?
Huge.
I knew.
Was that secret? Was that?
Chris Kovanov, family
Kyle,
FOE.
any other comments about what you're doing? Anything that's really fascinating? What's top of mind in the projects that you're doing right now? Kyle? Kylie?
Eileen, you're on mute.
Okay, the top of mind, frankly, is actually just, working on really impactful technologies and getting them the funding and the expertise that they need to grow. Because obviously there's a lot going on and there's a lot that we can do. And sometimes when you have big impact things going on, whether it's subsidies coming from the government or wars going on, it's a good time to really implement change. So that's what we're really focused on, is really just getting to work, the money and the expertise in order for us to have impactful change on the environment and build good projects and also be, profitable for our investors. So, I mean, it's very high level, but there's a lot going on, and we feel fortunate to be in the space and to be seeing the deal flow that we're seeing.
One more quick one, if I can.
Yeah, we have a question.
For Westguide, are you investing in solar, in thin film solar at all, or also space application of that?
Solar or space
No,
technology?
Westguide is the non-silicon solar with a high efficiency.
Non-silicon solar.
I'm not investing non-silicon solar. We've built a number of different solar farms, both for institutional takeoffs and also for direct to consumer.
Notice the technology is not yet at the farm level. It's underway.
Frank, again, I think solar is also going to be one of those things that we can eventually bypass, because we're really gearing towards like a closed loop system where you're taking what's here, you're reprocessing it, you're turning it into energy, and then you're recycling it all back again. Solar has the same issues of batteries, where you're using and mining and using a lot of materials that are bad for the environment. So it might produce some energy that is technically green, but the process of solar panels and all the rest of it is not a green manufacturing process. So we feel that we really want to focus on like the next stage of technology and the next stage of green, because we feel solar, battery, and electric cars are really actually not all that they're cracked up to be.
I think that my question probably then was not understood, because if you use perovskite, you're avoiding silicon, and if you're using space, you're avoiding batteries. So if you connect them, that would be the most available and the cleanest source of energy in the world forever.
Yeah, but I don't really think that technology right now is economical. I mean, with
Now talk to NASA, they will tell you that.
yeah,
I mean,
well,
if you look
solar
at
you
the
can
element,
produce for solar you can produce for 1 cent per kilowatt these days. So they also have something that they're building in Nevada where they have mirrors going up and they're reflecting off of it, but it's not economical, and it's not really doing anything different than many other technologies can do that are economical and also efficient.
Fantastic. Well, this is really great. Rich, any closing statements?
Well, I think we're surrounded by really smart and great people, both in the crowd, but also the speakers. So thank you for that. And obviously the theme here along, besides just ESG and impact in general, is this whole infrastructure build out in this whole big energy transition, and you've got a couple of real experts here, so I definitely would connect to them.
Do we have one more question from John?
One of the things that's confused the whole field is, and because there's a political divide, as you said, is the mixing of climate control types of things versus pollution control types. Where you have anti-pollution technology, all sides agree. Nobody wants chemical or harmful pollution in the environment, period. Nobody, right, left, center. When you get to climate, then the scientists are arguing with each other. People get into fads and fashions. Why focus on carbon and not methane, for example, which is far more, you know, a greenhouse gas than carbon. And nobody's talking about methane credits. I mean, the whole thing becomes a little, you know.
You just have to keep on launching your little Molotov cocktail, don't you? Huh? Okay, Lindsay, any closing statements? 'Cause that wasn't even a question. Lindsay?
No, I think I got everything across. It's been wonderful to meet everyone. Welcome, you know, continuing dialogues, and yeah, just nice to meet everyone.
Fantastic. Great job, guys. Thank you so much.